Hello all and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another amazing Florida 10. Today I'm in Orlando's beautiful Greenwood Cemetery. Established in 1880, Greenwood is just one of many of Orlando's historic cemeteries. In this video, I'll introduce you to 8 of them and present 10 amazing stories. I'll introduce you to Orlando's first white settlers, tell a story of a shocking political assassination, share how a wronged person got their bizarre revenge, and how an old cemetery became buried itself. I'll talk about a once famous Hall of Fame baseball player as well as a still famous artist. Introduce you to one of the bravest persons in the state, plus a talented young person cut down by cancer. So let's go look at our first cemetery and its amazing story.
Amazing fact number 1, the old cemetery in downtown.
Behind me you see a rather unassuming business block in downtown Orlando. We can call it the Baptist block because the Downtown Baptist Church has its home here, and before the Downtown Baptist Church it was the First Baptist Church of Orlando's home.
This block, bordered by Church, Pine, Magnolia, and Rosalind, was partly occupied by an early cemetery. It's sometimes referred to as the Baptist Cemetery as it was likely connected to the church, which was situated on the same block, but it was also a general burial ground for early Orlando, which had a number of Christian faiths among its residents. It was also where paupers were buried, the locals who couldn't afford the cost of burial. At the time, Orange County would provide for them. The cemetery was established around 1872, 3 years before Orlando was even incorporated. At about the same time the graveyard was opened, an L-shaped log frame building was built in the center of the block. During the week it was Orlando's first schoolhouse, and on Sundays it was a church where 4 denominations met on a rotating basis. The schoolhouse, church, and cemeteries served the small town well until the early 1880s. But that was when the railroad first arrived in Orlando, and it became a boomtown. Shops, offices, warehouses, and homes were being built at a remarkable pace, and soon there was hardly any open land left, except the cemetery. Property values had risen so high that leaders decided that Orlando would be better served if the cemetery was somewhere else. So an ordinance was passed, and families were given 6 months to remove their loved ones' remains. Most of them were relocated to Greenwood, and within a short while the cemetery was emptied and the property sold off. Oddly enough, the cemetery might have a more interesting story to tell after it was closed. See, in 1897, when the foundation was being dug for a new building, a grave was discovered. The solution? Reinter them in Greenwood. Then, in the 1950s, it happened again, and the same solution was applied. In 1977, it happened once more. The building at the corner of Pine and Magnolia, seen here, had 2 elevator shafts sunk into the ground. As you might guess, they found yet another grave. Imagine. This person had been resting undisturbed for about a century. But the story of this grave is different. The city granted a request to leave the remains there rather than move it, so the remains ended up under the building's lobby. If one believes in spirits, one would have to imagine the person is a bit restless these days. Next time you're visiting downtown, stop by the cemetery block and think about the early inhabitants.
This is one of only 2 mausoleums in Greenwood. There's not really anything particularly fancy about it, but it stands out because in this cemetery it's unusual. As you can see, the name above the entrance is simply Weeks. That stands for Fred Weeks, and his story after his arrival in Orlando around 1910 is one of the strangest imaginable. Upon arriving in Orlando, he learned of some land for sale by 3 men who had lived in the area since the 1880s. These 3 men, who are believed to have been prominent citizens, showed Weeks some of the land. Although much of it was obscured by a brush fire, Weeks liked what he saw. However, after the sale, Weeks discovered that much of the property was useless swampland.
It's not known how Weeks tried to get his money back, but apparently he wasn't able to do so. History does record, however, the rather unusual solution on which he settled. Weeks would eventually purchase another bit of land, a Greenwood cemetery plot to be exact. But unlike the people who bought grave sites nearby, he had immediate plans for his. He had a headstone carved with the following inscription: "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves." A New Testament verse from the Gospel of Luke. It's the verse that introduces the parable of the Good Samaritan. The verse was fitting in Weeks' situation. Below the verse, he also had the mason inscribe the names of the 3 men who had swindled him. Today, this action might have limited impact, but in 1911, the situation was rather different. Many families would visit their loved ones' grave sites, often bringing a picnic with them. Weeks' large monument was just inside the old entrance to Greenwood. It didn't take long before Weeks got his money back, and the families of the 3 men were persuaded to buy the Greenwood plot and remove the offending marker.
But the story doesn't end there. Weeks later purchased another site in Greenwood, and on that plot he had masons build this mausoleum. This is where he eventually was entombed, but before he was laid to rest, he had the same verse as well as the 3 names of the men inscribed on the door.
Local folklore says the men entered Greenwood in the dead of the night and chiseled their names from the marble door. No one will ever know for sure if the names were there, but just below the verse is a rectangular indentation that's large enough for 3 names. By the way, it's believed that Weeks died in 1918, though the date was never finished on the door. And one final note. Although Fred is inside, his wife isn't, leading to speculation that she wanted no part of a grudge that outlived everyone who was involved. Amazing fact number 3, Orlando's first white settlers. Lake Hill Cemetery is a rather unassuming plot of land, but in it are the remains of a fair share of early Orlandoans. Located on what was originally State Road 50 and today is Old Winter Garden Road, the privately owned cemetery doesn't stand out behind its low concrete block wall. And still, when driving into the cemetery on the horseshoe-shaped road, there's little visible to tell you its story. But when you stop at the small storage building, you'll notice a simple monument that reads, "A memorial to Captain Aaron Drnach, Orlando's first settler." And there you have it, the only monument to the head of the family that were the first homesteaders of what would become Orlando. Aaron Drnach and his wife Mary were from Georgia. They claimed 160 acres under the homesteading provisions of the Armed Occupation Act of 1842. That was at the end of the Second Seminole War, when nearly all Florida Seminoles had either been forcibly sent west to the Indian Territory, the land that would become Oklahoma, or were pushed into an informal reservation in southwest Florida. In 1843, the Drnachs would travel into the wilderness and build a cabin on the land near Lake Holden. Other settlers, including his brother's Isaac's family, would follow and settle nearby. There's few records other than land deeds and census data from that time, but it appears that Drnach's cabin became the center of the nascent community. Mule cart deliveries of provisions would stop there to disperse their goods, and that's where the U.S. mail stopped. We know this because the government recognized the name Drnach as the post office. But it was likely that the post office was simply the front porch of the small home. Aaron Drnach would come to possess 1,200 acres of land, and he was chosen to be the first state representative from Orange County. This was in 1845 when Florida achieved statehood and the county was renamed from Mosquito County. Around the same time, however, early settlers were developing the area that would eventually become the center of Orlando. A few of them seem to have had more influence than the Drnach settlers, and that area, next to Lake Eola, would eventually be the business center and the place chosen for the new courthouse in 1857. Thus Orlando was created and would be incorporated in 1875. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War in which Drnach served, he sold his land to a Virginian, William Holden, who gave his name to the lake that the Drnachs first lived on. But back to Lake Hill Cemetery. The memorial you can see was placed there in 1971, but there's a good reason it's there. While the cemetery is not very close to the Drnach's homestead, it does contain the remains of Aaron and Mary Drnach, whose markers rest on the western edge of the property close to the fence line. While several of Orlando's first white settlers arrived as recently as the 1850s, many of their burial sites are lost, so it's remarkable to be able to find these first ones. And if things had gone differently, today, much of Central Florida could have been called the Greater Drnach area. Amazing fact number 4. The early cemetery hidden on a main road.
This tiny cemetery is the Powell family cemetery located on Orange Avenue just south of downtown Orlando. The Powells were one of the first homesteaders in the Orlando area. The property that this sits on was once part of their family's property in the southern part of Orlando before Orlando even had its name.
Orange Avenue is one of the busiest north-south roads in Orlando. It heads directly south out of downtown. Because of its size, the fact that it's a bit above street level, and that people drive past at more than 30 miles an hour, I would expect the majority of locals don't even know it's there. I certainly drove past the site many times for about a decade before I learned that it even existed. Then, when looking for it, long before the internet existed, I passed it by multiple times before I finally found it. The Powell Cemetery is one of the smallest in Orlando, measuring about 80 feet by 140 feet, or 24 by 43 meters. Records from a survey done in 1963 show that there were 44 known graves, though 11 of them didn't have a name associated with them. The earliest marker is from 1877, though quite a few date from 1918 and 19. It's possible that these were a result of the 1918 influenza pandemic. Isaac and Sarah Ann Powell were from northern Florida and homesteaded in the Orlando area in the mid-1850s. They appear on the 1860 census along with 3 children, as well as Isaac's brother William, his wife Martha, and their 6 children. Both families were neighbors of the Drnachs. Though no Powell headstones remain in the cemetery, the Powells are supposed to have been among the first burials here, as it's been known as their family cemetery for more than 140 years.
This section of Greenwood was known as the colored section. Prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, cemeteries, like all aspects of Southern society, were segregated. Yes, even in death, black people and white people were expected to be separate. Throughout Florida, there are many cemeteries that were exclusively for black burials. Sometimes they were located next to white-only cemeteries, divided only by a road or just a fence. Bradenton, Orange City, and Tarpon Springs are among the communities that contain such cemeteries. After it was laid out, it was decided that Greenwood would reserve one of its larger sections for black graves. The section listed as T and K on the map, and which is set apart by driveways. This is where we'll find our next story.
Amazing fact number 5. One of Orange County's greatest heroes. On November 1st, the eve of the elections of 1920, Orlando's Evening Reporter-Star newspaper had the following headline: Klansmen, cowled and clad in flowing white, paraded Orlando's streets more than 500 strong. The newspaper reported that the anonymous members of the Ku Klux Klan, quote, treaded with dignity single file on Orange Avenue and into Church Street going west, to remind people here that the South was not dead but sleeping. Those supposedly anonymous Klan members certainly included some of Orlando's leading white men, including politicians and police, and they paraded directly into the city's black community as they headed west. It's safe to assume what their real message was. On Election Day itself, Mose Norman, a successful black citrus grower who lived in Ocoee in West Orange County, chose to ignore the repeated warnings from the Klan and attempted to exercise his right to vote. It's believed that he was properly registered to vote, but newspaper accounts state the men at the polls insisted that he hadn't paid his poll tax, a fee required to vote. He was sent away, but returned later, supposedly with a shotgun. This time he was overpowered, beaten, and sent away. Instead of going home, he went to the home of July Perry, a prosperous foreman of a large orange grove which was owned by a northern white man. Word spread around the white homes in the Ocoee area, and before dark a mob formed and headed towards Perry's home. The large white mob surrounded several homes in Ocoee's black settlement and began torching the buildings. A school, 2 churches, and around a dozen homes were razed. Norman, Perry, and others bravely fought from within the burning homes with the few guns they had. The newspapers reported that they killed 2 members of the white mob and injured 2 others. The papers also report that 5 black townsfolk were killed, though modern estimates say it was between 30 and 60 black men, women, and children who were killed in what became to be known as the Ocoee Massacre. Many of those killed were burned alive in their own homes. After his arm had been practically shot off, July Perry was captured by the mob and taken to the Orange County Jail in downtown Orlando. Later that night, his nearly lifeless body was removed by members of the same mob. It wasn't hard to do. Orange County Sheriff John Frank Gordon had handed over his keys to the mob. Perry was taken to the Orlando Country Club off Orange Blossom Trail, where he was lynched. Sheriff Gordon was nearby, since it was he who cut down the mutilated body. Perry's death certificate lists the cause of death as by being hung. Oddly enough, a different hand then wrote, not by violence caused by racial disturbance.
July Perry would be buried here in an unmarked grave in the black section of Greenwood. The position of his grave was remembered through the years, however, and in the fall of 2002, a marker was finally placed at his gravesite.
Amazing fact number 6. The brave teen who inspired thousands. Founded in 1924, Ohev Shalom is a beautifully maintained cemetery that shares a fence line with Lake Hill. It appears to be more formal than most of the cemeteries on this list, as it has ordered rows of trees and bushes, although the grave markers are fairly individualistic. The property is a narrow rectangle with a drive that runs down the length of the property. This is the cemetery for Congregation Ohev Shalom, which was Orlando's first synagogue when organized in 1918. The translation of its Hebrew name means lover of peace. Most cemeteries are peaceful, of course, but this is one of my favorites in the Orlando area, in which to relax and explore. It also contains one of my favorite markers of all time. This is Sidney Axner. The poem was written by Claire Harner in 1934, and it's been a popular poem for grave markers for some 80 years. I wish I knew the full story of how this headstone came to be. I love it for its uniqueness. So many stone markers have straight edges and sharply carved epitaphs, yet this example is rather pleasingly the opposite. And there's another remarkable marker that I want to talk about here. Unlike Sidney's, this one was professionally done, but it's more about the person it's memorializing than the stone itself. This is Talia Joy Castellano. Castellano was born in 1999 and became one of YouTube's early successful creators. The native Orlandoan began experiencing pain and fevers at the age of 7 and was diagnosed with neuroblastoma, a form of cancer located in the nervous system that's most common in children. Castellano's doctors aggressively fought the cancer, and at one point she was declared cancer-free, but had 3 relapses in her next 6 years. During the initial stages of the disease, Castellano became connected with a family friend who taught her how to use makeup. At the age of 12, her first makeup tutorial was posted on YouTube, and the channel quickly became popular, both for Castellano's makeup information and her discussions about her illness. The Ellen DeGeneres Show, a nationally televised talk show, invited Castellano to appear in 2012, and it was announced there that CoverGirl Cosmetics had chosen her to be an honorary CoverGirl. They presented her with $20,000, after which Castellano appeared in cancer awareness ads for the cosmetics line. Castellano used her newfound fame to help charities raise money to find a cure for neuroblastoma, all the while producing videos for her YouTube channel. By 2013, Castellano's cancer had metastasized and was considered terminal. At that point, she refused any more treatments and entered palliative care, which focused on her quality of life and reduction of suffering. She died in July 2013 and, of course, is buried here. Today, she is best remembered for her positive attitude and some of her affirming quotes such as, "Makeup is my wig," "When it's my turn to go, that will be my turn to go," and "Just keep swimming." A quote borrowed from the 2003 Pixar movie, Finding Nemo. The phrase was repeatedly spoken by Dory, a blue tang fish with short-term memory loss. Coincidentally, Dory was voiced by Ellen DeGeneres. As you can see here, between 2016 and 2022, the number of painted rocks that have been added to her grave has continued to increase. Amazing fact number 7, the assassination of an Orange County sheriff. Our next cemetery is probably the most hidden. And yes, I realize that I said that about the Powell family cemetery. Of course, it can be seen. All you have to do is look at it as you're stopped at a red light or are driving by. On the other hand, the Mizell family cemetery is hidden in a different way. It's still located next to a busy road, Corinne Drive, but you can't see it from the street. Where you can see it is inside Harry P. Lew Gardens, the City of Orlando's botanical gardens and museum. Still, even wandering around through the gardens, it's easy to miss the small cemetery, and while it's listed on the map, I'd guess most visitors never see it. That's probably good, however. Cemeteries aren't places for people to casually wander or children to play. Other than the graves and a historical marker, there's nothing of real interest in this tiny area of the gardens. Today, the City of Orlando owns the property, a 50-acre site that has remained intact for more than 150 years. Harry and Mary Jane Lew owned the property from 1936 until '61, when they donated it to the city. The Lews created the botanical garden for themselves. For more information on that, check out this video. It's one of the best botanical gardens in Florida, and it's easy to get to. The garden surrounded their home, which was already historically significant when they purchased it. The home, which was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1994, was originally the home of Angeline Mizell and was built by her son, John Thomas Mizell, in 1888. It's likely the oldest home in Orlando. The land was initially homesteaded by Angeline and her husband David W. Mizell in 1855. David W. was the son of another David Mizell, who had homesteaded in northern Florida after Florida became a U.S. territory in 1821. David W. was one of the first Americans born in Florida. Both David and Angeline are buried in the family cemetery. Angeline in 1911 and David in 1870. At the time of his death, David was the sheriff of Orange County. A Confederate Army veteran, Mizell chose to work with the Reconstruction government, unlike many of the residents of Orange County. This resulted in his assassination by members of the Barber family. Mose Barber was the head of the family and considered Mizell a traitor to the Confederate cause. Barber refused to pay taxes to the government, so Mizell and his men captured some of Barber's cattle to cover the costs. Eventually, Barber had enough, and on February 21, 1870, Barber and his men ambushed Mizell and murdered him. This made the situation far worse, as the Mizell family would seek revenge with the tacit support of local authorities, including David's brother John, who was a circuit court judge. The new sheriff, chosen by Judge Mizell, put together a posse only a few days later and went looking for members of the Barber family and their Confederates. Eventually, 41 men were killed, and there were no criminal convictions for any of the deaths. At some point, I'll make a video on what became known as the Barber-Mizell feud. And if you're wondering how Orange County's feud compares with the famous Hatfield-McCoy feud, that one resulted in 13 reported deaths, a rather small number compared to 41. Amazing fact number 8. The artist who painted Happy Little Trees. Woodlawn Memorial Park is the one we'll visit that's the furthest from downtown Orlando. It's only about 9 miles due west, not much further than Ohev, Shalom, and Lake Hill. Woodlawn is one of the modern cemeteries where nearly any creativity is prohibited. It has the flat-on-the-ground grave markers, making everything rather uniform. Still, the grounds are quite pretty, and there's a fair amount of decorative statuary. While it was established in 1926, much of the development is tied to the area's dramatic growth in the 1970s and 80s. In the rear of the cemetery, in Section O, is one of thousands of nondescript grave markers, but this one has many objects placed upon it, generally obscuring the name of the person buried beneath. Luckily, many of the items there will give you the idea it's the grave site of the much-loved artist Bob Ross. Few people realize that Ross lived in the area, but he was born in Daytona Beach in 1942 and raised in Orlando. At 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, rising to the rank of Master Sergeant. He became a painter while serving in Alaska, and since his income from art eventually outpaced his military pay, he decided putting his 20 years in was plenty and retired. After moving back to Orlando, he was approached to do a painting instruction show on public broadcasting. The show would eventually run from 1983 to 1994 and contain 403 episodes, each featuring a different painting. The show was very successful, with the majority of viewers never painting along with Ross. The end of the show came around the time that Ross became too sick to continue to work. While he had health problems on and off for most of his life, in the early 1990s he was diagnosed with lymphoma, a type of cancer. He was a heavy smoker, and it's also thought that his regular exposure to paints and solvents might have contributed to the cancer. Ross died on Independence Day, 1995, at the age of 52. Today, some 27 years after his passing, he's as popular and as famous as he was in the 1990s. While much lampooned for his painting techniques and style of presentation, millions of fans love him for those very reasons. His on-air demeanor can be compared to that of Fred Rogers, and he helped cement a certain relaxed and quiet style that is identified with informational shows on PBS. His gravesite continues to be popular with fans. Consider dropping by one day to see the artwork and mementos left there to honor him. Amazing fact number 9. A member of the Baseball Hall of Fame and valued Orlando resident.
This is the grave sites of Joseph and Ruby Tinker. Joe was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1946, just 2 years before his death. 46 was also the 10th anniversary of the first round of inductees into the Hall of Fame, and he was one of the first 49 men to be so honored. You can be forgiven if you've never heard of Tinker. He played shortstop a long time ago, primarily with the Chicago Cubs from 1902 to 1916, playing on 4 World Championship teams between 1906 and 1910.
Truthfully, the reason you might have heard his name at all was probably from a short poem written by New York sports writer Franklin Pierce Adams. Titled Baseball's Sad Lexicon, it goes like this. These are the saddest of possible words, Tinker to Evers to Chance. Trio of bear cubs and fleeter than birds, Tinker and Evers and Chance. Ruthlessly pricking our gonfalon bubble, making a giant hidden to a double, words that are heavy with nothing but trouble, Tinker to Evers to Chance. Not as epic as Casey at the bat, but when I was young it was well known to baseball fans. Remembering Joe Tinker for his baseball skills is worthwhile enough, but he and his wife Ruby were also important parts of the Orlando community in the first half of the 20th century. The Orlando Evening Star's headline for July 27, 1948 was, Tinker Dies on Birthday. It wrote, Tinker invested most of his baseball earnings in real estate during the Florida boom. He promoted the building of Tinker Field, now the spring training home of the Washington Nationals, and was instrumental in getting Cincinnati to train here in 1925. When built in 1923, Tinker Field had a deeper outfield than Yankee Stadium. It always gave the feeling of a laid-back Southern stadium with its trademark open press box and the many ceiling fans that kept a constant breeze flowing during Florida's humid summers. I'm sure I'll include Tinker Field in a future video, one where I'll have time to speak about its importance in the Orlando community, including the evening that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to a packed stadium in 1964. Beyond baseball, Tinker was very influential in the area. He purchased properties throughout both Orange and Seminole counties, and while he was financially hurt by the Great Depression, he kept control of his 1925 Tinker building on Pine Street, a structure that is now listed in the National Register of Historic Places, along with Tinker Field. He owned a billiard parlor, and when Prohibition ended in 1933, he opened one of the first bars. While he died due to complications associated with diabetes, the true tragedy of his life was that his first wife, Ruby, committed suicide on Christmas Day, 1923. Originally, the family marker for Joe and Ruby looked like this, but around 2010, a larger monument was added with a copy of Tinker's Baseball Hall of Fame plaque on it. Their original simple headstones are still out in front. Amazing fact number 10, the first woman to vote in Orlando.
Well, it may not look like much. In fact, it really is just an open field, but this is the Orange Hill Cemetery. It's known often as the Pauper Cemetery. It's located just south of downtown Orlando at the corner of Michigan and Fern Creek.
Few people who see this open field realize it's the old pauper graveyard. The cemetery sits on less than 2 acres in an active business area and is part of a much larger complex that includes the National Guard Armory, Juvenile Justice Center, and the Medical Examiner's Office. No known records exist to tell us how many individuals were interred at the site or what their names were. A survey in the 1950s showed over 500 potential grave sites. It's considered full, and the current sign for the cemetery shows an operating span between 1907 and 1961, though an earlier marker said it closed as early as 1943. There's only a few visible signs that this is a cemetery. For example, there's a handful of cut stone blocks in the ground that were the supports of headstones. Sadly, the vast majority of individuals who are buried in Orange Hill are anonymous, with one notable exception. Hiram C. Calder arrived in Orlando from Virginia with his young wife sometime in 1904. Calder worked locally for a bakery, and his wife, whose name has been forgotten by history, was a stage actress who had toured the country since she was 14. Friends of the couple remember them both as being educated. Later on, the Calders had moved to Tampa, where the wife died of typhoid fever in 1911. Now widowed, Calder moved back to Orlando. 3 years later, he contracted pellagra, a disease caused by a chronic lack of niacin in the diet. It's likely evidence of Calder's poverty, as pellagra was common among poor people in the South who subsisted on corn. In the spring of 1914, Calder was taken to the Orange County Home for Indigents, and by summer was suffering from dementia. The doctor who was called to attend Calder made a remarkable discovery. Hiram Calder was a woman. Calder died on July 14, 1914, and was buried in Orange Hill. Calder's real name was never discovered, and in her mental state she was unable to provide an explanation for the deception. The discovery shocked not only the residents of Orlando. Newspapers across the state carried the stunning news. It was later discovered that Calder once gave birth to a daughter out of wedlock. To save them both from shame, the daughter would eventually pretend to be Calder's wife when she began to masquerade as a man. Once they moved to Orlando, the couple did everything they could to promulgate the deception.
Calder even went so far as to register and vote in several elections. Since she voted prior to the 19th Amendment, Calder was likely the first woman to vote in the state of Florida. The progressive newspaper, the Orlando Morning Sentinel, commented on the situation, noting, "A woman masquerading as a man votes for years in Orlando, But strange to say, neither the city, county, state, or nation was totally ruined by their ballot. So those are 10 stories from Orlando's historic cemeteries. I hope you found them interesting. Let me know in the comments which one you thought was the most interesting. As I wrap this up, let me give you an idea of where each of these cemeteries is using this map.
The downtown cemetery was located between Pine and Church Streets and Magnolia and Roslyn Avenues. By the way, in Orlando, many east-west roads are named streets, while north-south ones are avenues. Greenwood borders Anderson Street on its north boundary, but its entrance is more hidden at the east end of Small Greenwood Street. Lake Hill and Ohev Shalom are on Old Winter Garden Road just west of Kirkman Avenue. The Mizell family is in Lou Gardens, making it one of the few cemeteries in the country that generally requires an admission fee. Orange Hill is on Michigan Street and Fern Creek Avenue. The Powell Cemetery is on the west side of Orange Avenue, just south of downtown. Woodlawn is west of Orlando off Old Winter Garden Road, just west of Good Homes Road.
Thank you for watching another of my videos. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.